Paul, thank you so much for joining. For the audience that doesn't know you yet, please tell them a little intro about yourself and how you got here.
Thanks for having me, Victor. And thanks for being a champion of podcasting. I love podcasting. And we were joking before we hit record. I've done 342 episodes as of this week. Obviously, I'm pretty passionate about it. My name is Paul Zelizer, and I've been working with social entrepreneurs and passionate about social entrepreneurship for 17 years now, and have the Awarepreneurs podcast, which I am the host of. And we've been doing that for 7 years, 342 episodes. So that's a little bit about me.
That's really impressive. And for the audience that doesn't know, what is a social entrepreneur? What exactly is that?
The really short answer is somebody who's trying to pull on the lever of business to make the world a better place while they're earning a livelihood. If we want to get a little more technical about it, most people know what the United Nations is. I've heard about it. The United Nations has said in order for humans to continue to live sustainably on planet Earth, they have what they call the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. And they said if we pay attention to these 17 areas, it's everything from being smart about our water usage or regenerative agriculture or paying attention to gender issues and making sure women are being well thought of, and diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Renewable energy. Those 17 areas, most social entrepreneurs use those as a measure of places we should be paying attention to.
Got it. So it's basically an entrepreneur, but with also paying attention to what's going on in society as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Most people would call business, normally we talk about the bottom line. So when we're usually talking about business, we're talking about single bottom line businesses, and social entrepreneurs are triple bottom line businesses: people, profit, and planet.
I love that. I love that. And going into the podcast side, 340 episodes is a huge undertaking. What made it where you were able to stay consistent by constantly uploading your podcast?
One of my big suggestions, Victor, is to pick something you're passionate about. Like podcasting it's a build. It's not typically like sometimes on YouTube, somebody just makes a video about the right topic at the right moment. It just blows up. But podcasting usually is a slow build. It's going to take some time. And if you're not passionate about your topic, the chance that your audience is going to be and that it's going to grow is very slim. So I'll give you an example. I just hung up about 15 minutes before we jumped on the call with a wonderful, just an amazing social entrepreneur named Brando Crespi. And Brando has been using a technology for sustainable agriculture called biochar. The guy's been at it for 45 years. He's helped lift 7 million people out of extreme poverty using this technology. He's been helping to advise the United Nations. The guy's traveled the world, worked in 62 countries. To get to sit down with somebody like that and understand what they've did and how they are thinking about business and helping communities that are often don't have a lot of resources. Even if nobody ever listened, it was an incredible experience to talk to somebody like that, learn from them. And the other thing that I have learned is I try not to make a podcast a one-time event, but if the guest is open to it, to stay in touch with them. I do that on LinkedIn. So it's an opportunity to build my network. I love podcasting, and it's not just about a marketing strategy for me, although it obviously is that, but I learn, I build my network. I get invited to things that I never, ever would have been invited to, just incredible opportunities. And I just like humans and hearing about cool things. So that's helped me stay with it. There's so many things that I get over and above the financial returns that it would be silly for me not to wake up in the morning and do an episode.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really does help open up your network where getting, for example, to get on a call with someone with a very high status, very big in the just any niche that you're in, and all of a sudden you can schedule, like if you were just to book a call, they would say, "Oh no, I don't have time for that." But if you were to book a podcast with them, you get to actually communicate with them and understand and get really connect with them. It's really opens up a lot of opportunities that way.
When I was starting my business, I was a burnt out social worker that still wanted to help people, but needed to get into business. I don't have an MBA. I don't even have bachelor's level business training, and nobody knew who I was, right? So I
Mhm.
needed to find a strategy that sort of allowed me to get into conversations that I was hungry to get into, where like all the action was, but I didn't have a ticket to the dance. And podcasting has helped me get tickets to both in New Mexico where I live. I'm going to a event tonight that it's not easy to get invited to, but also globally. I get invited to things all the time. I can't even go to all the things I get invited to. So it just got me the ticket to the dance, and it has been a game changer for me.
That's amazing. And what would be a recommendation for someone trying to find that? A, find their passion, and then B, find a podcast like conversation to center around that passion.
That's a great question, Victor. I would say, first of all, start with your values. Before you try to create a business, it's social entrepreneurship 101. If you need some help with this, Simon Sinek has a great book called Start With Why. But I watch people trying to build businesses, and if we only engage the small part of our brain that is like, how do I make money, which is a very important conversation. When I was reinventing myself as a social entrepreneur, I had a kid, I was getting divorced, I needed to make money. So I don't want to minimize that. But if we start there, it tends to not be very full spectrum. People can feel when we're just like, oh, I saw this opportunity to make money. And so I launched a podcast or I just put up a website. And the only thing I really care about is the cash. Again, I don't have a judgment against that. I'm an entrepreneur, but it just doesn't tend to last. And I know I can tell if I turn on a podcast in the first 5 minutes, is the host really engaged or not? I can
Mhm.
tell, and usually it doesn't. It usually takes me about 3 seconds, right? I can
Yeah.
hear your voice. If I can see your face, I can notice how you're asking questions. I can tell if you've done your homework. And we as humans are just wired that way. So when we're doing something that's an extension of our values and we know what our values are, and then we build a business around that, and then we layer our podcast into that, it's a whole different animal. So the first thing I always do when I meet with a new client, I said, tell me about your values, tell me about the impact you want to have. And then we'll talk about your client and your product and how it's going to get marketed and all that. But I see a lot of new podcasters try to jump to where's their market opportunity, which is, again, I understand the entrepreneur mindset. But if it doesn't sync up with your values, the impact you want to have, the dent you want to make in the universe, the chance that it's going to go anywhere in 2024 when there's a lot of podcasts out there, pretty slim, honestly.
Yeah, and it also helps prevent burnout as well, where like
100%.
you actually get your like natural motivation going.
Yeah.
It makes it where it's very easy. Where honestly, if you weren't passionate about it, you'd probably give up around like five. Like you probably wouldn't get past five podcasts most likely with all the effort it
That's
takes to
what the
go
research
into it.
tells us. 5 to 7 episodes and the average podcast dies.
Yeah, which is crazy. And so like it really comes down to like what you said about values and making sure that really making sure that it is a part of your life in a way. So like where it's this is a piece of your life and you're moving with it rather than it whatever maybe you see it as taking away from a piece of your life that you normally wouldn't get. So as long as it's a part of your life and you see the value inside of it, that means other people will see the value. But if you're not passionate about it and you don't see the value in it, then no one else is going to see the value in it.
Totally. Totally.
So you were the
So,
main driver behind it.
yeah. So let me turn it around. It seems like you're pretty passionate about podcasting and you have podcast expansion. Why do you care about podcasting?
I care about podcasts because it's a method to, it's another way to communicate to the world and to do it at a large scale amount of content, meaning that you can take an hour segment of a podcast, take all the little value tidbits, and take those communication pieces and give that to the world. Whereas if you were to make another social media to make 15 social media clips by one with your phone, that would take a really long time.
Yeah.
It's just a way to scale up the amount of communication that you have and then also to communicate with another person and just go back and forth, which is also part of the networking side of things.
Yeah.
I also like learning, but that's a really big thing for me. I get to learn what the perspective of the particular podcast guest is. And it's really important to understand that. And I take all those tidbits of value pieces and I put them into clips for social media for other people, which helps them. And that also, therefore, makes me feel good as well by helping them,
Yeah.
type of thing.
So listeners, I don't know if you believe Victor, but I do. Like I can feel it, right? I can feel your passion. You're not just telling a story. Your body language, your voice, like you resonate as somebody who's genuinely passionate, not just saying the words. And I've been around enough podcasters to know. So listeners, find your version of what Victor is saying with whatever you're going to launch would be my biggest suggestion.
That's amazing. And then what is your biggest thing that you see podcasters do wrong? We talked a little bit about not being passionate about what you're talking about, but is there anything else that you see? Oh, like where you might look at, oh, this podcaster's like all these podcasters are doing usually this one tidbit wrong. Is there anything you see there?
Three things. I'll just say I run a small podcast accelerator. It's called the Impact Podcast Accelerator. So I teach podcasting to other people who want to have positive impact through their business. I have thought about this again, and I get asked a lot about this. So three things. Number one is just chatting. Like podcasting is this unique mix of it wants to be relational. You're a very relational human, Victor, and that's a strength. And most podcasters are, but sometimes they forget that there's somebody listening and we want to provide value. So there's a difference between just having a cup of coffee, you and I, without a camera, without microphones, and how we might chat in that context versus forgetting or remembering, I'm sorry, that there's somebody watching this and how can we provide value to them at the same time that I'm getting to know you and your passion and why you're doing this and trying to share information. So there's this two-level awareness of how do I have a great conversation with Victor and make you shine and get to know you and have some fun and learn from you and connect with you, but also that the people that are watching this, I'm very cognizant of them and I want to provide value, not just chat with you. So that's one mistake. The second mistake is I think it's really unfortunate, a missed opportunity. Most people who listen to podcasts literally put us inside of their bodies. It's an incredibly intimate form. I think the most intimate form of mass communication. And if you and I have never chatted before and we hit record, we're doing something that I think is suboptimal. That is, at least for me, I always try to have a pre-interview meeting. I call it a meet and greet with every guest because I don't want to be in the situation where I'm like, hi, complete stranger, I just hit record, have a world-class conversation, go. I want my listeners to have the experience where there's some rapport right from the moment we hit record, as opposed to trying to do that live in real time. Because podcasting is so intimate. Now, it does take more time to do that, but that's time I'm willing to invest. And again, I have 342 episodes. So that's another mistake I think a lot of podcasters make if they're going to be doing interview podcasts. Go say hi, build a little relationship before you hit record. Some people do it on the same day, spend 15 minutes chatting and then record, or I like to do it on a separate day. The third is coming up with a strategic plan to provide that value for whatever the episode is. So in that pre-interview meet and greet is what I call it, I actually work with the person that I'm going to be interviewing. We come up with a title together and we come up with at least 3 points of value and ideally a strategy that they use in their business for each of those points. You don't have to do exactly that, but I think hosts who have some idea of the terrain that they're wanting to cover and have some ideas of the main action points, the main things somebody can listen to the podcast and not just say, Victor's a nice guy, Paul's a nice guy, but rather, oh yeah, Paul might have suggested to do a pre-interview before. I never thought of that before. Or to go into each episode knowing what the title is. And for me, it's not just a title, that is really the storyline that I'm trying to cover, and then have some strategies that people can take away based on that I came up with the host, the guests together. What I hear from people who listen to Awarepreneurs, the name of my podcast, is they take a lot of actionable strategies away, and that's by design, not by accident.
Got it. Yeah, and I try to find a balance between structure and improv, I guess is the word, between we're like really trying to extract all the knowledge outside of the guest and communicating that to the people that are listening. And I used to be very structured with like bullet points, like what I'm going to talk, like almost not like a script, but almost like a script.
Right.
And I went away from that because I'm not very good at like rules or like structure. That
What
number
are you, an
one. Uh,
entrepreneur or something?
so I'm not very good at like those rules or structures. But number two, also, I found that it was more valuable to go down, for example, like you talked about a certain topic and we might go down that rabbit hole. And so it makes it where it's a lot more dynamic and the audience could get more value out of that by certain knowledge that I didn't know you had. And we can go down that rabbit hole and play around with it. So I think and everyone can find their like balance between structure and improv when it comes down to podcasting.
Absolutely. And another thing I'd add is to know your audience. So part of the reason I'll show you, this is my notes from the episode I
Well,
just recorded with Brando. I have some bullet points going into it. And my audience is social entrepreneurs who've been at it for a while and are looking to scale. They're not brand new social. At least 55% of my audience has been at it for 2 to 3 years minimum. Average is probably 8 to 10 years for their businesses. So for my audience, it makes sense to be as diligent as I am about providing strategies. And for a different audience, it might be all overly scripted or just not so helpful or too much, or somebody might just be wanting more of a kind of that sort of impromptu conversation. So I think part of it, I would widen back and just say, knowing your audience and what they're looking for and why they're listening. And people often say, how do you do that, Paul? For me, I encourage a lot of interaction. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so I know some of my listeners from there. I get emails from people making suggestions about guests or following up. And every episode say, I want to hear from you. And not every listener has emailed me, but quite a few of them have over the years. And I'll go look at their website. I'll go look at their LinkedIn profile. Somebody is given me the gift of inputting something. I'm going to go do a little bit of homework. Who are they? And if you've been doing that for 7 years or even 6 months, you're going to find patterns of who's listening. And then I would say craft your intentions of your show with the knowledge of who's listening. You're going to get better results than if you have no idea who's listening or why.
and I had a podcast guest about 2 times ago, and he said basically treat like your podcast rather than whispering or talking in the microphone. Act like you're talking in your guest's ear and or in your audience's ear. And
Absolutely.
because you are technically talking to your audience's ear, and so if you talk in a way that you're directly talking to your audience, you're going to be a lot more effective in communicating to them and making sure that you're communicating the right context, really.
100%. Yeah. So this is Paul whispering in your ear, listeners. Go get
Yeah.
to know your audience. You'll get so much more out of your podcast if you actually get to understand a little bit about who's listening.
100%.
Yeah.
And it's going to be difficult when you start out because you're not going to get a lot of comments or interactions to
100%.
understand and that's hard. I will say that when you feel like you're just talking to yourself, but when you're passionate about it, you're okay with really no one looking at it yet. And the example I always go to, they're like, hey, Victor, I only have 20 people that look at my podcast every single time. And the way I see it is if you got 20 people in a room, and they all like whatever listen to you speak, that would be awesome.
Right.
And if you post it on social media, like on TikTok, you get 200 views. And with 200 people in a room, that would be insane to get. That's how I see it. But very try to go more positive with it. And now I have like certain posts. I'm a country dancer, and those things do really well on social media. So I see it as, hey, if you have 20 views or 200 views or 2,000 views, either way, if you really treat like, hey, these are going to be people in a room, then that's a lot of people regardless. And don't let that discourage you. Just have fun with it. As long as you're having fun with it, that's really all that matters.
100%. And also, I would add, be mindful, like, at least for me, I'm not trying to be the world's biggest entrepreneur pod. I'm not trying to compete. Probably the best known entrepreneur podcast is Entrepreneurs on Fire. That freaking huge audience, massive. And John Lee Demas has built something just awesome. I'm talking to a smaller audience. The number of social entrepreneurs is growing. Social entrepreneurship is one of the fastest growing majors in college campuses all around the world. But I don't have a story that I'm trying to compete with John Lee Demas and Entrepreneurs on Fire. I'm talking to a very clear audience, and we're trying to do certain things, share information. And I don't have millions of views or even hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands, but a couple thousand downloads per episode. Like you said, if there were 2,000 people sitting in a room and watching something at a conference, that would be a huge win. And I've
Yeah.
also adopted my business model. I offer consulting and a podcast accelerator. I have like ongoing revenue. I'm not trying to sell t-shirts or hats where I would need a massive audience just to pay my bills. I've adapted my business model to make it sustainable to have more of a niche podcast. And it takes the pressure off of how many views and how many downloads. It's just, let's get the best quality people I can. Let's do incredibly rich interviews with a lot of actionable suggestions. And I've been doing it for 7 years now. And part of the reason I still stay with it is because I took the pressure off to grow to massive numbers, but instead, let's be the deepest. That's my goal. Be the deepest, most information rich, get the most experienced social entrepreneurs on the planet. And what that means is when I get an email, the quality of the care of the work that person is doing is off the charts. And those are my people, not somebody who's lightly curious or never really thought much about social entrepreneurs. So I
Yeah.
don't need a gazillion views or downloads.
There also is a balance between being strict and lenient on what your particular audience is. For example, you can go super niche down of if you start like a, let's say like a Dallas Cowboy podcast. Yes, there's a balance between you could start the linebackers of Dallas Cowboy podcast.
Yeah,
Like you can get so narrow, and but if that's something you want to do and you'll have a good time with that, by all means. But it's a balance of not being too general and not being too specific,
yeah,
and narrowing it down so that way you have a big enough audience. And you can even use Google Keyword Planner to see the search queries on how much monthly search volume on Google to
yeah,
see what that particular search volume would be. And if there's less than 1,000, maybe less than 500 per month, you'd be able to say, hey, this probably isn't big enough. But
exactly.
you can find that balance between both by just even just using Google search.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe it's a football podcast on defense instead of Dallas Cowboy
Yeah.
linebackers, right?
Exactly. And so we just talked about everything that a podcaster could do wrong. What would be your number one piece of advice for a podcast to be successful these days?
Try to get a website up or at least a podcast page on a website fairly early on, even if it's a very simple website. It's pretty easy to build a website these days with all the platforms out there. You all
Yeah.
know that you can figure out how to do it DIY, simple site, pay somebody maybe to do a logo, and you can do the rest yourself, or you can get a website pretty reasonable these days. But have something that people can get off your podcast and go find what you're offering in
Mhm.
terms of even a relatively small but growing monetization fairly early on in the trajectory of your podcast tends to, like, if you just make $300 and then $500 and then $800, you're 6 months in, if you're making $800, you're more likely to stay with it than if you're making zero. So try to fairly early on be thinking without rushing it, how this can sync up, whatever the content is, with some of your entrepreneur goals. And if you start to see, even, it doesn't have to be hockey stick growth, that's always fun, but even if you just start to see some gentle growth in your monetization, people tend to stay with it more. And it's hard to sell things if you don't have a web presence. If you're only on YouTube or only on Apple Podcasts or only on Spotify, people can't buy things there, or they're less likely to. So try to get a web presence up fairly early on, and it just gives you more cred. Hey, this isn't just a hobby. This is synced up. This is a professional endeavor. My first logo for Awarepreneurs, I think, cost me $250, and she knocked it out of, maybe it was $400. She knocked it out of the park, and I still use it. So I paid for three or whatever it was, $100, and I built the website myself, and we're still using the logo because I haven't found any need to change it. So it cost me under $500 to get that website going, and I've made many thousands of dollars without doing any major ginormous changes in my branding.
That's great. And the reason why starting a podcast first versus a business first is because when you start a business, the hardest part is the marketing. the most expensive and like the most expensive part and the hardest part is to understand the marketing dynamic, because anyone can start a business, but most of the time if you start a business no one's going to know about it.
Yep.
And so when you start a business or when you start a podcast and you build up that audience and you understand that dynamic, then that is the most valuable piece. That audience that you built is super super valuable, and there's going to be some way that you can turn that into a business to offer more value, but also at a cost. It's going to be really important to understand that like audience building dynamic, which is going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a year or two to understand how to build up an audience and things like that. But once you have mastered that, then you can utilize that for your business. So it is a smart approach to starting a podcast, building up that audience, and then starting a business, because you could, once you listen to your audience, you could say, hey, what do you guys really want? What would you guys pay for?
Yeah.
And if they'll answer and they'll respond, and so that will give you ideas on what types of businesses to start and things like that to do it. And you're doing the hardest part, which is the audience building. Everything else is easy, in my opinion. Everything else is super easy in business besides the marketing.
It's often one of the key places people get tripped up, for sure. And the other thing I would say is we now have some incredible AI tools, podcast specific AI tools. So once you have a podcast, I'll give you an example. One of my favorite, one of the best AI tools I've ever seen anywhere for anything is called Cast Magic. It's a podcast specific tool where you upload your audio, or you can put the YouTube link in if it's a video podcast. And Cast Magic not only does a transcript, which is everywhere these days, but it takes your episode, it'll write your newsletter for you based on the episode. It'll write LinkedIn posts. It'll give tweet threads. It pulls out the most poignant clips, like it gives you 10 to 12 key moments with timestamps so you can make them into short videos or whatever else you might want to do, audiograms. Trying to remember all the other things. And then there is a separate panel that you can tell it, like, let's say you want a blog post based on your episode, but it didn't write it for you. You can say, write a 600-word blog post based on this episode. And it is ChatGPT, but it combines ChatGPT with your language that's in the podcast. So it sounds more like you than anything I've ever seen. So you do your podcast, and then you have this incredible AI assistant. Now, it is not perfect. I would never suggest anybody just cut and paste, and that is your newsletter. Still AI. Sometimes it makes mistakes, but it sounds like you. And it's like having a marketing team take your content and get it. I like to say it's like having an MBA student as an intern, or right, like the first year, they're super smart. They understand the general principles of marketing and good writing and stuff. And they might not know your topic 100%, but they get it 80% of the way there, first draft, in seconds from when you upload it. And then you just polish it and get it to all the way over the finish line. It is a game changer. I think it's $20 a month or something like that. It's a game changer in terms of marketing to have that kind of support. So anybody who's thinking about starting a podcast, what you just said, Victor, it helps overcome those marketing challenges because you create the content once, and then you can use it to feed your marketing machine. Now you have a newsletter. Now you're on LinkedIn. Now you're like got video shorts, and they're all the best of the best from the content you're producing, repurposed based on a team that is sounding like you for $20 a month. It's unheard of.
And you also have to think with AI that this is the easiest time to start a podcast than it ever
100%.
has been.
Yeah.
Or ever. And it's only going to get easier with all the next AI tools. So
100%.
it is very, don't get me wrong, starting a podcast is hard, takes a lot of work and things like that. But it is the easiest time to start a podcast with all the new AI tools that
100%.
ever has been.
Another AI tool that I teach our accelerator members about is called Resound. I think it's Resound FM, or it's Resound. And it does the sound engineering. It also removes filler words, and it's really good. It identifies spaces, and you can automate, like if there's a long pause in your episode and things like that. And again, it's very affordable. Again, I think you need to just go through and select like the pauses. If I just automatically cut them all out, it sounds compressed and a little bit artificial, but it just identifies, keep this one, delete this one, keep this one, delete this one. And it makes the sound engineering something that used to cost hundreds or thousands of dollars a month, or take you to do it yourself many hours. it turns it into a 5-minute process. And the sound engineering, it does automatically. It gets rid of the filler words by itself. I just go through and manually listen to the sound, the pauses, but it takes me just a few minutes to do it. And I used to hire that all out. And like I said, I think it's $15 a month or something like that.
And I'm about to say something that I'm guilty of. One thing that is going to be super important is that you're able to listen to your own podcasts.
Yes.
I need to do more job at like finding a good time and place to actually do it. But you want to listen to your own podcast so you get context and figure out what parts do you find boring. And so if you can't find it engaging to listen to your own podcast, then probably no one else is going to find it engaging.
Exactly.
And
Oh, I hate listening to that show. Wait, it's mine. Then you got a problem, right?
Exactly. After you do finish an episode, it is important that you listen to your own episodes, especially like your new ones, so you can say, okay, how did this guest do, or how did this particular thing do, and so that way you have a little bit of context, and so that way you can know what to optimize and change for the next episode.
Yeah, and it's also fun when you've been at it for a while. Like I go back and listen to an episode from 5 years ago and just notice, oh wow, I'm better at this. Or that's right, I used to do that and I forgot about that. There were some things I was doing intentionally 5 years ago that just fell off the map. Let me try that. Oh yeah, that was a great. Why did I stop doing that?
Yep.
So I would encourage you to definitely listen to the new ones, but every once in a while go back to one of the earlier ones and just notice. It also for me highlights, I don't always see it day to day, but I think I've grown as a podcast host and I'm more skillful and more intentional and I understand the audience better. So I think I've gotten better through time, but sometimes I forget and I'm like, oh, wow, yeah, I wasn't that good at 6 months in. I was passionate, but I think I'm smoother. I'm more relaxed. I can have fun. I tell jokes. I have my shtick, we would say in Yiddish, right? I'm just a different kind of a host, and I don't always notice that day to day. And going back reminds me, dude, you've grown some. Good job.
100%. And before we end the episode, for your last tidbit, your one actionable takeaway saying, hey, if you're a podcaster, go and do this. What would be the one actionable takeaway from this podcast?
It's a great question, Victor. The single biggest thing is don't be in isolation. Go connect with other podcasters. That's why I started the podcast accelerator we have, specific for people who want to use podcasting for positive impact. But there's so many awesome. Elsie Escobar and Jess Kupernan, who I both interviewed, they have She Podcasts, an awesome conference of women podcasters. And there's tech podcasting communities and sports podcasting communities and podcaster host communities, right? And impact podcast communities. Go join a community. It's really hard to both learn the tech of it, and just reading blog posts is very different than talking to other podcasters and just bouncing ideas off of or exchanging listens. Hey, would you listen to one of my episodes and give me feedback? And I'll listen to one of your episodes and give you feedback. Trying to stay on top of AI tools. My brother is a podcaster. He's awesome. Craig Zelizer has a podcast called the Social Change Career Podcast. So Craig, my brother, is a career coach who works with people who want to have positive impact. I'm an entrepreneur coach with entrepreneurs who want to have positive impact. We both have podcasts and we are constantly like sharing, hey, here's this AI tool or here's a guest. I get a lot of my guests from other podcasters who know what I do. I think you get a sense of what I'm talking about. You will be better with community than if you are isolated.
100%. Yeah, I just learned about Cast Magic. I never heard of that. We use Squadcast to cut up all the like ums and ahs and things like that. Yeah. But yeah, I'll check that out.
It's next level. I've never had another AI tool be more helpful to my business. And I'm not talking about the podcast, any AI tool for any aspect of my business. It's so far game changer that I am super grateful to the people who built it.
Yeah, $20 a month, baby.
$20 a month, and you're like totally like you are a marketing machine for $20 a month. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Paul, thank you so much for joining. Please tell the audience how to find you. If they have any questions and you're telling them about your podcasts, tell them all that stuff.
Thanks so much, Victor. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. And thank you for your passion for podcasting. I share it and I can feel it. It's genuine. Thank you for what you do. If somebody wants to get a hold of me, LinkedIn is one of the best ways for all the various things I do. I have my fingers in a lot of pies, and LinkedIn is one place. So if you're a LinkedIn user, if you want to listen to my podcast, go check out awarepreneurs. It's the first part of the word awareness and the second part of the word entrepreneurs, awarepreneurs, plural. And that's where you can also find out about our Impact Podcast Accelerator. Awesome group of folks who are sharing ideas, both on the tech side, but also on the how to be a great host part of the podcasting journey. So check out the Impact Podcast Accelerator.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. You're a very genuine person. So thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the audience that did get this far. This is the Podcast Expansion Network, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, guys.